I'm Ville Lähde. I'm originally a philosopher of training, but most of my academic work has been in environmental policy in the University of Tampere. And I have also worked for various NGOs, other citizens movements over the years. But currently I'm working at a multidisciplinary research unit called BIOS, and we combine environmental studies with public outreach and education, which is, well, my forte currently. Well, to limit the effects and to combat climate change and the other great global or regional challenges in the coming future, well, the basic challenge is to lessen, to decrease the negative environmental impact from human activity, not just to slow down the growth of negative environmental impact, which is basically the situation where we are now. And a good proxy for measuring the human environmental impact is the material throughput through human economies, the amount that humans take so to speak virgin natural materials from ecosystems and natural reserves and put it through the economic process. And that material consumption has continuously increased from decade to decade, and it is still increasing. And the rate of increase actually has been quicker than, for example, population growth. Not by an order of magnitude, but still a lot faster. And at the same time, as we can see from the second graph, climate change emissions have grown. In a couple of recent years there was a talk about a hiatus in the growth of emissions, but that was actually only in relation to CO2. If we look at the sum total of all emissions in carbon equivalents, we can show that see that there never was actually a hiatus in the growth of emissions. So there is not a sign of absolute decoupling between material consumption and climate emissions and human economies and human society. On a global scale, we don't even have a sign of a relative decoupling. There are some signs if we look at some regions. I'll go into that a little bit deeper. But we are talking about global environmental problems, so the only really relevant scale here is global. If we are talking about the state of the oceans or the state of the atmosphere, for example, we have to look at the material throughput, not only in view of the regions or countries, we have to look at the global scale at the same time. Because emissions, for example, of course, as we know, they don't respect natural boundaries, and ecosystems span various kinds of human social boundaries. And on the other hand, global division of labor and global trade in commodities means that the results of human action, the results of consumption of resources are externalized or outsourced from region to region, which again makes the global viewpoint necessary. As we can see from the third graph, which looks at Finland, Finland, for example, is a net receiver of natural resources. On the bottom column, we can see the direct extraction of natural resources in the Finnish national area, but more than half of it are the direct currents of resources or the hidden currents of resources that are embedded in the products. Of course, Finland also trades, exports stuff, but in sum total, Finland and other affluent countries are net receivers of natural resources. And the problem here is regarding, for example, sustainable social and ecological development, is that whereas poorer countries are net exporters of resources, the currents of capital are moving on the opposite direction. So these countries are not sustainably building their welfare on the basis of the material currents. So if we limit our viewpoint when we think about the possibilities of decoupling or the possibilities of circular economies, if we limit our viewpoint only to Finland or only to Europe or only to the old industrialized countries, we tend to get an overtly optimistic viewpoint, because then we discount the role of trade and the related outsourcing of environmental effects. What's more, it's not only about the amount of natural resources we use. We cannot look at human environmental impact only by measuring metric tons, for example, because then we would think that sand and herrings and uranium and water are the same thing, which they obviously are not. You have to look at the quality of resources and the effort that is being used, or the effort that is being put in their extraction. How much energy is being used, how much secondary resources, for example, like pure water, are being consumed, for example, in mineral extraction and so on. And the problem here is that as resource stocks get older, they tend to become depleted or degraded, and you have to spend more and more effort to get the same amount of reward. So really the issue here is the effort and not the reward. Of course, the amount of resources we use gives us the rough sort of ballpark where we are going, but the effort really tells us about the human nature interaction. The extreme example, for example, are global fish stocks, especially in the oceans. The effort of fishing is growing constantly, but the fish catches are going down. And this is highly problematic for the poorest people of the world, because the poorest communities are more directly dependent on the immediate surroundings for food, for energy, water, and so on. And as the environment degrades in this highly intensive resource exploitation, poverty becomes relatively deeper and relatively more entrenched. Well, circular economy is often nowadays touted as the solution to this basic problem. And yes, recycling is important, reusing products is important, and more durable life cycles are important. But basically, any sort of circular economy has hard thermodynamic limits. Material degrades as it goes through generations. And what's more, if you use minute amounts, for example, some rare earth metals that are used in computers or cellular phone, it gets progressively harder to recycle them because the amounts are small. Thus, it's not possible to get everything circular. We cannot totally close the economies. We have to lessen the amount of material throw. That is basically the requirement for achieving any sort of strong sustainability, which would allow us to look at the future of human societies in the scale of centuries or even millennia and not decades. That is basically our outlook nowadays. Well, fundamentally, the solution is that we have to realize the same needs, fulfill the same needs that we have, but in a fundamentally different way. In some senses, this is quite simple. Instead of personal cars, we need more mass transit. Instead of highly animal product-based diets, we need more plant-based. Instead of larger apartments, we need smaller apartments. Instead of heating by fossil fuels. We need heating by more sustainable energy. And also we basically need different forms of gaining social status, social standing, social recognition from others than from competing by material possessions, which makes it, of course, a hard thing, because it's not only an issue of building new infrastructures, it is also an issue of changing social valuations. One problem that is often raised up in this issue is called rebound. The problem is that when you get more energy-saving devices, for example, better cars, whatnot, you save money, and then that money tends to be used or invested into something else, because, well, money doesn't like to be idle, as the marketeers like to say. And in current societies there are incentives to do this, or there are even forces that force us to do that. It's seen as irrational not to invest or not to use your money to some other form of consumption. In other terms, we also have legacy problems. Our infrastructure of our society is built on the basis of this sort of consumption, that the assumption is that people will want to use more energy, people will want to use more material resources. The problem here is that we have a history of continuous growth in the material throughput, and due to various reasons we actually had to decrease the material throughput quite quickly. Part of the solution is in circular economy, part of the solution is simply cutting down the material use of virgin resources. I'm convinced that this cannot be done if we only rely on the idea that some form of technology is coming in 10 years or 5 years or 20 years to save us. It cannot be done only by market-based action, because currently markets are based on the incentive of reusing or reinvesting the money that is saved on other fields. So thus you need also political and social direction. You need political intervention, you need disincentives, you need incentives, but you also need a change in cultural valuations. And when it comes to citizens or people who are working in the field of sustainability, they will have to rethink the role of the individual, not only as a consumer or not only as a person who gives one vote. They have to rethink the role of people as active citizens who really want to change the way that our societies are organized and how we value things, because if we only value things in the GDP-based thinking, we will never be able to handle the issue of material throughput, which is at the heart of our relationship with nature.